The mud of late 1944 was a cold, thick paste that sucked at your boots with every step. For the men of Baker Company, trudging along the Siegfried Line, every day was a blur of gray skies, skeletal trees, and the constant gnawing tension of what lay ahead. This part of the German border was a dragon's spine of concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and tank traps. Most were empty, abandoned in the retreat. Some weren't. Private Miller, all of 19 and built like a scarecrow, put his shoulder against the steel door set deep into an earthen mound. It was slick with moss and cold enough to steal the warmth from his gloves. "Feels solid, Lieutenant." Lieutenant Davis ran a hand over his weary face. "What do you think, Sergeant? Another ammo dump?" Sergeant Kowalski grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Could be naps, could be a booby trap. Only one way to find out." He wedged a crowbar into the seam. With a collective groan of effort from 3 men, the steel protested, screeching as rust and ice gave way. The door swung inward into absolute blackness. And then the smell hit them. It wasn't the expected odor of cordite, damp concrete, or death. It was impossible. A wave of stale air washed over them, carrying the scent of yeast, chalky dust, and a faint phantom sweetness, like an apple orchard in late autumn. "What in God's name?" Miller whispered, his voice cracking. Davis clicked on his flashlight, its beam a nervous white spear cutting through the dark. It swept across the interior, and the men fell silent. The bunker wasn't filled with shells or machine guns. It was stacked, floor to ceiling, with wooden crates. Thousands of them. The light played over stenciled lettering on the nearest boxes. Paul Roger, Veuve Clicquot, Pommery and Greno. Below the names were years. 1937, 1928, 1926. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said, his voice low and tight. "It's champagne." The beam danced deeper into the cavernous space, revealing an unbelievable treasure trove. Pallets of wooden cases stretched back into the gloom, a king's ransom of liquid gold hidden beneath a battlefield. This wasn't just a few bottles looted by a thirsty officer. This was a systematic hoard, an underground treasury. As they stepped inside, their boots crunched on scattered straw. It was an eerie, almost sacred silence, broken only by their own breathing. The air was thick with the ghost of celebration, a bizarre counterpoint to the rumble of distant artillery. These bottles were symbols of a world away. They spoke of Parisian cafes, of laughter and crystal flutes, of a life that felt like a distant dream. Yet here they were in a concrete tomb, requisitioned and stockpiled by the very men they were fighting. German officers, it turned out, had developed a profound appreciation for the spoils of France. Special units had swept through the cellars of Reims and Epernay, seizing the finest vintages. For high-ranking commanders, these weren't just drinks. They were currency, bribes, tools for maintaining morale and status amidst the collapse. Miller's light caught a glint near the floor. A thin strand of wire, almost invisible, snaked around the leg of a pallet stacked high with krug. "Tripwire," he hissed, freezing in place. Every man stopped breathing. Was this whole cellar a trap? A final, cynical joke from the retreating Wehrmacht? Kowalski moved with a cat-like grace, his wire cutters appearing in his hand as if by magic. A careful snip, and the wire went slack. The collective exhale was a gust of wind in the still air. "Just a little welcome present," Kowalski muttered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Another soldier, a wisecracking kid from Brooklyn named Shapiro, let out a nervous laugh. "Imagine getting taken out by a bottle of bubbly. What would they write on your tombstone?" The joke hung in the air, a fragile attempt to ward off the sheer strangeness of the moment. Davis stepped closer to a crate of Taitinger, its lid already pried slightly open. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth glass of a bottle. The foil was intact, the wax seal unbroken. Whose hands had last touched it? The soldier's hands, rough and dirt-caked, traced the lettering on the crates. It's not just military markings. Their fingers brush over stenciled words that seem alien in this concrete tomb. Moat, Veuve Clicquot, Taitinger, Pommery. The dates alongside them are even more jarring. 1921, 1928. These aren't just supplies. They're relics from a world before the war. A private pulls out a small leather-bound ledger found tucked between 2 cases. He flips it open. The pages are filled with neat, spidery German script. His buddy, who knows a little of the language, leans in to translate. Columns of train numbers, destinations, allocations. The word West Wall appears again and again, linked to specific depots. This wasn't just hoarding. It was a highly organized supply chain, a river of gold flowing from France directly to the German front lines. But how did it get here? To understand that, you have to go deeper, not just into this bunker, but into the very ground beneath the Champagne region itself. Under the towns of Reims and Epernay lies another world, the Craers. These are ancient chalk cellars, a vast network of tunnels and caves dug out centuries ago. During the occupation, these chalky labyrinths became more than just cellars for aging wine. They became sanctuaries. French families took shelter in them during bombing raids, and deep within these cool, dark passages, they guarded their most precious heritage, millions of bottles of champagne. This wasn't just a drink. It was their culture, their livelihood, their identity, trapped underground with them. Above ground, the occupiers moved quickly to control this liquid treasure. They appointed a Weinführer for the Champagne region, an official whose sole job was to manage the wine. A man named Otto Klebisch held this post, a figure who became both feared and despised. His task was to impose quotas, seizing hundreds of thousands of bottles to be shipped back for the German officer messes, high command parties, and the Nazi elite. The demands were relentless. The finest vintages were systematically drained from the cellars to fuel the Reich's celebrations. In response, the French fought back not with guns, but with cunning. In 1941, they formed the Comité Interprofessionnel du Vin de Champagne, or the CIVC. On the surface, it was a committee to manage production and protect the wine's quality standards. In reality, it was a masterclass in organized resistance. The winemakers of the CIVC became experts in deception. They would build false walls in the deepest parts of their cellars, hiding their best vintages behind a facade of empty racks or inferior bottles. They mislabeled entire stacks, passing off prized champagne as simple table wine. Inventories were doctored, shipments were mysteriously lost in transit, and entire harvests were declared spoiled. Every bottle saved was a small victory, a quiet act of defiance against the occupiers. They were fighting to save the soul of champagne, one cork at a time. Back in the suffocating air of the bunker, the reality of this hidden war becomes chillingly clear. A sapper, brought in to inspect the find, suddenly freezes. His flashlight beam fixes on a single point. A hair-thin wire, almost invisible, runs from the lid of a crate to a small metallic object tucked in the shadows. A booby trap. His hand signals for everyone to back away. No one breathes. Another soldier notices a detail on a different crate, a wax seal. Not from a champagne house, but stamped with the crisp, sharp image of a German eagle. This was official Reich property. A young private, no older than 20, runs a thumb over the elegant, curved label of a bottle of Pommery. The paper is cool and slightly damp. For a fleeting second, he imagines the world this bottle came from glittering Paris salons. Laughter. Music, a world so far removed from the percussive thump of distant artillery that rattles the very earth around them. The order is given. Touch nothing. The engineers have to clear the entire cache before a single bottle can be moved. But as the men stand back, watching the bomb disposal team get to work, the question hangs heavier in the air than the dust motes dancing in their flashlight beams. What do you do with a treasure like this? A treasure bought with deception, hidden by patriots, and stolen by an enemy who rigged it to kill. Each tick of the clock feels like a heartbeat, each one deepening the silence. The glow from the engineer's lamp paints long dancing shadows across the damp chalk walls of the bunker. Outside, the world is a landscape of mud and waiting. Inside, it's a cathedral of bottles, a silent, glittering army standing guard in the dark. Time stretches, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, muffled thud of artillery and the steady drip of condensation. A young private, a farm boy from Ohio, with dirt permanently etched into the lines of his hands, traces a name on a dusty bottle with his finger. Epernay, he whispers, the word foreign and strange on his tongue, like a prayer or a curse. He imagines a place with that name, a place without the constant fear, a place where things grow in neat rows under a peaceful sun, not unlike the cornfields he left behind. But this feels a world away, a dream spoken into the cold subterranean air. Another soldier, his face gaunt, his eyes holding a depth of history far older than this war, runs a hand over a wooden crate. He's from Brooklyn, And he can't help but think about what else the Germans hoarded in places like this. Not just wine. He thinks of menorahs, of family portraits, of holy books stripped from homes and synagogues. To him, these bottles aren't just treasure. They're a symbol of everything that was taken, a silent testament to a world turned upside down. Each cork is a seal on a stolen story. The lieutenant, barely older than the men he commands, feels the weight of his responsibility pressing down. He remembers the words from Eisenhower's own directive, memorized and recited until they were part of him. All works of art, historical and cultural objects, will be safeguarded for their rightful owners. Looting was forbidden. This wasn't a prize. It was property. His duty was clear, but the faces of his men, hollowed by hunger and the gnawing cold, make the black and white of the order blur into shades of gray. The champagne becomes a mirror, reflecting the turmoil within each man. For some, it's a tantalizing promise of release, a single moment of warmth and oblivion in a war that has taken so much. A taste of something other than fear, something that reminds them they are still alive, still capable of feeling something good. For others, it's a test of character, a challenge to their discipline. How do you remain a good soldier, a good man, when the rules of the world have been so thoroughly broken? And in the quiet, another story hangs in the air, a story of the people who belong here. We can almost see him, a French cellar master in Reims, years ago, chalking false inventory numbers onto a blackened wall. He listens to the heavy thud of jackboots on the floorboards above, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He prays that the wall he built, the fake one hiding his most precious vintages, will hold. He prays that one day, people who don't wear swastikas will walk these cellars again. He prays for liberation, a word that tastes as sweet and complex as the finest champagne. The air in the bunker is thick with the scent of damp earth and chalk dust, which now coats the cuffs of the soldiers' uniforms. An engineer, his movements slow and deliberate, finally eases a cork from a bottle he was inspecting. The sound isn't a celebratory pop, but a soft, sweet sigh, releasing a smell of fruit and metal into the confined space. The paper label, softened by the humidity, peels slightly under his thumb. This isn't a party. It's an examination, a delicate and tense procedure. Across the front, in other cellars, other soldiers didn't hesitate. Bottles were opened, toasts were made to survival. But here, in this pocket of quiet tension, they wait. The line between duty and desire, between preservation and the primal need for a moment's peace, is as thin as a tripwire. The engineer continues his methodical sweep. He kneels, the beam of his lamp cutting a sharp path through the gloom. He slides a small mirror on an extendable rod under a low row of wooden crates, angling it to see what lies hidden in the deep shadows. The mirror catches the light, and for a heart-stopping second, a tiny, sharp glint flashes back. It could be anything. A shard of a broken bottle, a stray piece of metal. Or it could be the polished brass firing pin of a booby trap, a final, spiteful welcome from the retreating enemy. The engineer freezes. Every man in the cellar holds his breath. The glint winks at them from the darkness, an unspoken question. The lieutenant looks from the soldier's face to the crate, his mind racing. Celebration, discipline, or death. The choice is his, and it has to be made now. The decision was made in the damp chill of the cellar, whispered between men whose faces were just pale smudges in the darkness. There would be no hesitation, no second-guessing. The cash had to be secured. Every crate, every single bottle, would be documented and moved under heavy guard to the nearest French authority. This wasn't just a recovery. It was a rescue mission. The order crackled over the radio. Operation Vintage was a go. The cellar transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, like a combat operation in miniature. Under strict blackout conditions, with only the faintest beams from shielded flashlights cutting through the gloom, the cataloging began. Each crate was carefully examined. The chalk markings, elegant and faded, were copied meticulously into a crisp new U.S. Army ledger. Every number, every vineyard name, was a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a culture they were trying to save. The air was thick with the scent of old earth, damp stone, and the faint, tantalizing promise of wine. Outside, the night was anything but silent. In the distance, the rhythmic thump of German artillery grew steadily closer, the shells walking their way across the countryside, feeling for targets in the dark. The sound was a constant drumming reminder of the urgency. There was no time to spare. A makeshift winch system groaned as it lifted the heavy wooden crates one by one from the cellar's mouth, swinging them onto the beds of waiting transport trucks. Soldiers, their faces grim with concentration, guided each precious package as if it were a bomb, their breath fogging in the cold night air. Finally, the last crate was loaded. Engines coughed to life, their low rumble a defiant answer to the distant guns. The convoy pulled out, a line of dark shapes slipping onto the pine-black roads. They drove with only narrow slits of light from their headlamps, navigating a landscape of ghosts. Ruined villages slid by, skeletal remains of homes and shops silhouetted against the bruised pre-dawn sky. The drivers were tense, knuckles white on the steering wheels, eyes scanning the darkness for shell craters and debris. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistle tore through the air, followed by a deafening crack. A shell had landed terrifyingly close. Shrapnel ripped through the canvas top of the third truck. Men shouted, diving for the scant cover of the ditch. There was a sharp pop, then a hiss. A golden spray erupted from a shattered crate, the priceless liquid arcing through the air for a fleeting moment before vanishing into the churned mud. The men stared, a profound silence falling over them as the smell of champagne, impossibly festive, mixed with the acrid scent of cordite. One driver reached over and patted the bottle he'd strapped into the seat beside him, whispering to it as if it were a frightened child. Miles away in a German staff mess, the atmosphere was one of strained anticipation. A New Year's banquet was planned. Finely dressed officers checked their watches, awaiting the special deliveries promised for the occasion. In an adjutant's office, new orders were being drafted in a tidy Gothic script. Directives for an orderly advance while, unknown to them, their western front was beginning to fray and collapse. The champagne they were waiting for would never arrive. Back on the road, the convoy faced its next challenge, a narrow stone bridge over a dark Russian river. A key plank was missing, leaving a treacherous gap. Each truck had to crawl across, one wheel's width from the edge, the old stones groaning under the weight. On the far side, the headlamps briefly illuminated a small roadside shrine, a stone Virgin Mary watching over them from her niche, her face serene and untouched by the war. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, the ordeal was almost over. The shelling had faded behind them. The convoy, mud-caked and weary, nosed into the central square of a battered but still standing French town. The hiss of air brakes seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet. The engines idled, and for a moment nothing happened. Then doors opened. Figures emerged from the damaged buildings, their faces a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated weariness. A small crowd began to gather. From the town hall, a man stepped forward. He was older, his face a roadmap of hardship, but he stood tall. A red, white, and blue tricolor armband was pinned to his coat. It was the mayor. He approached the lead truck, his expression unreadable, and the entire square held its breath in a moment of wary, hopeful silence. In the damp quiet of the liberated cellar, a French cellar master, his coat a ghost of white chalk dust, moved with the slow reverence of a man entering a tomb. He ran a practiced hand over the crude stencils spray-painted by the Germans. His fingers traced the faint impressions of foil, the subtle riddling marks left like fingerprints on the glass necks. Beside him, an American lieutenant held a captured German ledger, its pages filled with meticulous cold accounting. But the old man barely glanced at the book. His own memory was the true ledger. He'd stop at a rack, his breath held, his eyes distant. He'd pull a bottle, tilting it gently in the lantern light. "This one," he'd murmur, more to himself than to the soldiers watching. "I remember this run. We hid it behind a false wall in 42. I thought it was lost forever." He pointed to another row. "And this was the last vintage my father disgorged. Before the war took him, a profound stillness settled over the small group. There was no riotous cheer, no backslapping celebration. Instead, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the cavern, a long, slow exhale of tension held for years. The war wasn't over, not really, but this small battle, fought in silence and shadow, was won. Up in the sunlight of the village square, the return was formalized. A simple table was set up. The American officer presented a document. The cellar master, his hand trembling slightly, signed his name. The officer countersigned. A GI with a camera snapped a single photograph, capturing the quiet dignity of the moment. Then, the cellar master himself picked up a hammer and nails. With careful, deliberate strikes, he sealed the first crate of his returned property. Each hammer blew a punctuation mark at the end of a long, terrible sentence. We must honor the messy truth, of course. Elsewhere, in the chaos of advancing armies, other cellars weren't so lucky. Bottles were drunk in the field by thirsty soldiers, a fleeting taste of luxury in a world of mud and fear. Not every stolen treasure, whether wine or art, found its way home. But here, in this small French town, this moment stood as a testament to a choice made under the immense strain of war. A choice to restore, not just to conquer. "One bottle," the cellar master announced, his voice thick with emotion. He selected a single bottle, its label faded. With the practiced ease of a lifetime, he worked the cork free. It released not with a triumphant pop, but a gentle hiss. He poured modest measures into glasses for the GIS, the mayor, and the few townspeople who had gathered. As the tiny bubbles rose through the golden liquid, catching the morning light, they drank. The champagne tasted of chalk and crisp apple, of the ancient earth beneath their feet. And it tasted of the end of something terrible. This small act of restitution was part of a much larger, often overlooked, chapter of the war. Across Europe, special Allied units, the famed monuments men among them, were engaged in a monumental treasure hunt. They were turning battle into restoration, following leads into salt mines like Merkers, recovering trainloads of stolen art, library books, and cultural artifacts. Their work was a quiet counterpoint to the thunder of artillery, a promise that this was not just a war of destruction, but a fight for preservation. In a conflict defined by steel and scarcity, where every resource was weaponized, a rescued glass of champagne became more than just a drink. It was a symbol. It was proof that what was plundered could be returned, that what was broken could be mended. It was a quiet declaration that the truest measure of victory is found not only in what an army seizes, but in what it chooses to give back. There are countless stories like this, where small choices made by ordinary people reveal the true soul of a vast war. If you want to uncover more of these untold histories, make sure you subscribe and join us for our next exploration.